It's time for Normal Show Live's Cannabis Science with Dr. Mitch Earleywine. Dr. Earleywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York in Albany and the author of Understanding Marijuana. Now here's your dose of cannabis science.
All right, welcome back, Tokers and Tokettes, to a special edition of our Cannabis Science with Dr. Mitch Earleywine. Dr. Mitch, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be on the show.
Before we get into the big, heavy subject we've got to cover, I always give you the chance at the beginning of the segment to let us know if there's any new studies or new clinical information we need to know about cannabis in the science papers today.
This was actually a relatively slow week, so I've got a few obscure things in the animal literature that I actually am having trouble understanding completely, and so I'll have to report on them next week once I wade through them.
Okay. All right, we'll do that. Let's get right to the news. Of course, we've been discussing over the past couple days the tragedy in Tucson, Arizona, where apparently mentally ill man, Jared Lautner, is alleged to have shot and killed 6 people, including U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords, in what is apparently his assassination attempt, according to his own writings. And one of the things that has come up recently has been Jared Lautner's alleged use of marijuana. And a lot of people now are saying, bringing up a lot of the pot and schizophrenia angle, you know, that he was a schizophrenic, he was obviously mentally ill. And particularly, I wanted to address this, Dr. Mitch. David Frum is a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, and he wrote an article entitled, "Did Pot Trigger Gifford's Shooting?" And in the article, Frum says, quote, "The connection between marijuana and schizophrenia is both controversial and complicated. The raw association is strong. Schizophrenics are twice as likely to smoke marijuana as non-schizophrenics, and people who smoke marijuana are twice as likely to develop schizophrenia as those who do not smoke." I know a lot of people in the community are, up on this story and are hearing these things from Frum and other writers out there. I'm just wondering if you could set David Frum and these other people straight about the relationship between marijuana and schizophrenia.
I'd be delighted, Russ. The bottom line is his statistics are completely off. There is one study that suggests longitudinally that folks who use cannabis heavily early in life and who have double whammy, oddball genetic risk for psychotic disorders are more likely to develop psychotic disorders. The idea that people who smoke pot twice as likely to develop schizophrenia is completely fallacious and completely inconsistent with the data that we have. When you take a close look at that one study, and it's done by Timmy Moffitt's group, and I love Timmy, I think she's wonderful, their work is actually stellar, but you take a look, they report these percentages. Once you sub in the numbers for the percentages, you realize there are 7 who fit in this group. 7 people who actually had this genetic risk, who actually used cannabis enough times, and who ended up with a psychotic-like disorder, not actually full-blown schizophrenia. The fact that we're basing a whole world's policy on 7 people who went mildly awry is just so frightening, I don't even know where to begin. To then say we're going to isolate a single cause for one psychotic person's outrageously deviant behavior is just absolutely retarded. And if you don't think so, by all means, let's walk through how the last 3 presidents of the United States have used cannabis. Do we say, oh, and by the way, cannabis now increases your probability of becoming president? Of course not. It's retarded. Right? And I think emphasizing time and again the order of the operation, if you will, is also out of whack. Sure, tons and tons of people who use cannabis end up schizophrenic, but tons and tons, literally millions of people who use cannabis every single day and are not psychotic at all. This is obviously counter to the whole idea that this is causal, and it's just so insane that we've walked this way through the policy. Instead of now saying, hey, let's get rid of cannabis, why don't we say, let's spend money on good mental health? There would be all these opportunities for people like him to get good mental health if we had, say, better health care. Why don't we go that direction? No, instead we want to blame it on a plant that has a 5,000-year history of safety.
Yeah, it's so sad that this is the conclusion, and we see conclusions being jumped to on all sides of the aisle here. We've got people that say, well, easy access to guns is the problem. Others that say, well, easy access to pot is the problem. We have some that say, the leaders on the left are trying to pin this on rhetoric on the right, and people on the right are saying that people on the left are trying to. And really, this is just a mental health issue. The man obviously had, if you saw his YouTube videos and some of his rantings and scribblings, he obviously had some sort of severe mental disorder. Now, I know you didn't examine the man or have any close contact with him, but what are you seeing in his behavior, in his writings, from a mental health perspective?
Well, so the writing clearly has a psychotic component. What you'll see are things we call magical ideation, thoughts that obviously don't make sense from our usual perceptions of what causality is, and then some paranoid ideation. So the notion that a number of people are out to harm him based on what sounds like at least very, very little evidence. This is consistent with some subtypes of schizophrenia as well as some milder psychoses, some psychotic disorders that aren't necessarily full-blown schizophrenia. These folks are at risk for committing a number of violent acts, but that doesn't mean everybody with a psychotic disorder commits a violent act. Of course. I mean, I've lived with psychotic people who don't have any kind of history of violence. And again, the clincher here is to try to explain any single case is preposterous. What do our data do? They talk about large trends in large samples over a long period of time. This is one outrageous, anomalous event that is absolutely tragic and horrible, but to pretend like we can pin this on a single cause is pretty difficult. And it really only supports the idea that we need better mental health care throughout the U.S.
We're speaking with Dr. Mitch Earleywine, a professor of psychology at SUNY Albany and an expert in cannabis and mental health issues and studies. Continuing on with what David Frum wrote, he concluded by saying, the trend these days seems toward a more casual attitude and easier access to marijuana. Among the things we should be discussing in the aftermath of this horror is the accumulating evidence of those drugs, and he's meaning marijuana, potential contribution to making some dangerous people even more dangerous than they might otherwise have been. Now, if we're going to talk about trends, and with respect to what David Frum is saying, he's kind of implying medical marijuana, I would assume here. But we have records of the use of marijuana going back, throughout this century and, of course, centuries before. Is there any correlation between the increased use of cannabis and the increase in psychoses or schizophrenia or violent outbursts or anything?
So as far as the published data are concerned, what you'll notice is schizophrenia itself is always around just a little less than 1% in the population. And that's dropped over the years in part because of the better prenatal care. We're much better with pregnant women, making sure that delivery complications are minimized, but it still ends up being right around that range. And if you look at countries that have really outrageously horrible marijuana laws, their rates of schizophrenia are very much the same as those that have more liberal laws. So that doesn't seem to be accounting for it. Wayne Hall at Australia has chided me and said, no, now we're seeing some modest increases in psychosis diagnosis in folks who are starting earlier in life, but those data have not been published yet. And I feel like this has taken on a life of its own based on hearsay and just oddball prejudices, and we don't actually have the empirical literature there. Now, obviously, schizophrenics shouldn't do, hardcore heavy hitting of cannabis, but they should stay away from Benadryl. They should keep their caffeine consumption down. And if we're going to talk about drugs contributing to aggression, the drug that is by far most involved, of course, is alcohol. The U.S. government, me, Mitch Earleywine, Dr. Pot, money to show that alcohol increases aggression. We've known this for decades, and obviously that would be the one to actually regulate more. And then the tacit assumption that an illicit market in marijuana is a good idea as far as control is concerned is preposterous. Who is going to card somebody? Who is going to make sure a mentally ill person isn't going to obtain cannabis? An underground dealer on the street, or somebody who could lose their license to sell the product if they did such a thing?
Yeah, well, very well put. And to conclude here with the David Frum thing, he links and block quotes from the from a Time magazine summary on the marijuana and schizophrenia data that are out there. The summary itself in Time magazine seemed to be pretty balanced. It said, well, here's some studies that say there's these correlations, but on the other hand, here's the studies that show there really is no correlation. And there was this one paragraph that he didn't even, mention at all, saying that some schizophrenics may be getting a boost from using cannabis, using it either self-medicating or in these clinical situations. This was lead author Cecile Henket, an assistant professor of psychology and psychiatry at Maastricht University in Holland, said, quote, "Everyone feels better, but schizophrenia patients also have less anxiety and are less socially withdrawn even after the effects of the cannabis has worn off." Is it possible Jared Lautner was becoming schizophrenic, feeling these schizophrenic symptoms, and self-medicating with cannabis to try to stop it?
That's distinctly possible, and we've seen this go in both directions. Thorne and Kraft published a paper back in 1990 saying, hey, if you do this, you're more likely to have a lapse if you're psychotic. But in fact, it may very well be that folks are noticing some of the odd sensations they get prior to a schizophrenic break, trying to medicate themselves, sometimes successfully. And I think that may be strain dependent. It may have something to do with cannabidiol rather than THC. And then they make this effort to essentially delay what may be an inevitable psychotic break. The notion that cannabis might actually help psychotic people is also not as insane as it may sound at first blush. Although pure THC does seem to make this magical ideation and other paranoid ideas worse, cannabidiol really puts a damper on that, as we've seen across strains. And if there were a strain that were higher in cannabidiol, like we've been emphasizing over the last year, that could actually be a benefit to folks who have magical ideation or other symptoms that are associated with psychoses.
But we would say, generally speaking, someone who is feeling the effects of schizophrenia, psychoses, starting to feel paranoid, delusional in some manner, that any sort of use of cannabis, regardless of strain or THC or CBD, it shouldn't be done without, a doctor's supervision. Is that fair to say?
Well, and in fact, I think we don't know enough about it to say that that would even be something somebody would write a recommendation for. Instead, we need to have decent access to multiple strains of medical marijuana, which of course we don't, and then use that in a clinical trial with highly supervised individuals in an inpatient setting so we could really monitor and see how that works. But here's just another example of how prohibition has really impeded our opportunities to make the best use of this plant.
Yeah. For all those people out there that are worried that cannabis may have contributed in some way to Jared Lautner's mental illness or the violence that took place, I always have to think, well, what do you want to do? Make it illegal? I mean, it's already illegal, folks, and it didn't seem to help in that situation. All right. Before we leave that subject, is there anything else about the schizophrenia or the Lautner shooting that you'd like to add, Dr. Mitch?
I really want to throw out the consistent notion that cannabis never leads to aggression. And I mean, I know when I say never, I'm going to get emails of counterexamples that everybody's experienced. But when you're in the lab, we've seen folks who have cannabis or placebo each get in these situations where some stooge hired by the experimenter comes in and irritates them on purpose. It is all weed who get angrier, not the folks who are smoking the cannabis. And I think in part it's because they thought they were going to get pot and they got in and got placebo. But nevertheless, we do not see this as a substance that's going to increase hostility in any way. I cannot say the same for caffeine, for alcohol, for some of the over-the-counter antihistamines, and for all of the prescription stimulants. So obviously, if we're going to try to intervene at a medical level on the pharmacological side for aggression, cannabis is hardly the place to start.
I am so glad we had this opportunity to discuss in depth this subject, because it's being bandied around in the media a whole bunch, and I think most people